7 months sealed. The pack registry marks your room as storage. He said you asked for the quiet. He said the arrangement suited everyone. He calls himself your guardian. The 53rd thread fox lay in Lynn's palm, still warm where her thumb had pressed the final knot into its tail. She had worked it from 3 separate strands of unraveled wool, grey, brown, the dull green of her old blanket's hem, and the knotting had taken 2 hours because her fingers had gone stiff from the cold. Not from the work itself. From the draft that came through the shuttered window, the one that had been nailed shut 6 months ago with 2 iron pegs, and her own silence. She was on the upper floor of Grafenhold, in the room that Derek Vallon, alpha of the Grafen pack, had assigned her 4 years ago. It had been presented as an honor. A private room, a quiet space for recovery. She had not understood at 19 that the honor came with a lock on the outside of the door. The room was not large. A cot with a wool mattress that had compressed over years to something barely distinguishable from the floor, a small table, a single candle at a time, replaced on alternating Wednesdays when someone remembered. A window that faced north and let in no afternoon light, only that flat grey morning sky that looked the same whether it was winter or not. She had spent the first year trying to understand what she had done wrong. She had spent the second year reading every fragment of print she could find, labels off jars, the backs of old receipts slid under her door by accident, a water-damaged almanac she'd found lodged behind the cot frame. She'd read the almanac 7 times. She knew the average rainfall of the Kethrun River basin in more detail than she knew her own birth date, which Derek had told her, at 11, that she'd gotten wrong when she tried to correct him. She had spent the 3rd and 4th years noticing things. That was the word she used for it, privately, noticing, not because she had any official status, any role, any window she was permitted to open, but because sounds travel through old timber in predictable ways, and the pack house below her was old timber through and through. She knew when the head cook watered down the broth. She knew which pups were getting sick before the healers did, because she could hear them coughing through 2 floors of planking, and she recognized the wet rattle that meant a cough had moved into the chest. She knew when Derek raised his voice at his beaters and when he did not, and the pattern of one told her more than the pattern of the other. She had no wolf. She had been tested twice, once at 12 by a specialist Derek brought from the Southern Territories, once at 16 when she'd begun to show an aptitude for herblore that made him uneasy. Both times the result was the same. No inner beast, no connection. The specialist at 16 had used the phrase functionally hollow and written it on a form she later found in Derek's office because someone had left the door unlatched. She was not hollow. She knew this the same way she knew the rainfall averages, not because anyone had told her, because she had noticed. The thread fox in her palm shivered. It happened the way it always happened, a warmth that started in her wrist and traveled outward through her fingers, into the knotted wool, and then the fox simply was. Not animated in any mechanical sense, not a trick of the light or a twitch of her hand. It stood in her palm and shook itself the way a real animal shakes off water, and its tiny knotted eyes, she'd used seed beads she found in the drawer lining, caught the candle's glow. Lynn pressed her lips together and breathed warm air across its back. "You're the 53rd, she whispered. "I don't know if any of the others made it anywhere. I don't know if you will either. But the twins on the east floor, one of them has had a chest cough for 11 days. And it sounds wrong now, and the root cellar herbs are rotting from the wrong temperature. Someone changed the ventilation, and no one has noticed. 7 families in this pack will have no fever reduction come February." She paused. The fox turned its head. She was always startled by that, even now. "I know your thread," she said. "I know your wool and knots and 6 hours of work I'll never get back. But if you find someone who can do something, tell them about the twins first." She set the fox on the sill beside the gap where one iron peg had worked itself slightly loose from the frame. The fox crossed the wood in 4 small steps, found the gap, and slipped through into the dark. Lynn sat back and pulled her blanket over her shoulders. The wool was thinner than it had been a year ago. She was careful not to unravel too much from any single area. She took from the edges, rotating sections, the way you harvest from a garden instead of pulling everything at once. She did not think about the fact that she was slowly dismantling the only warmth she owned to make things that might not reach anyone. She had stopped thinking about things like that around the same time she'd stopped crying, not because the feeling had gone, because it had settled into something quieter than feeling, something that lived in the room with her, the way the draft did, present, constant, not worth remarking on anymore. There was a difference between sadness and the absence of hope. Sadness still had energy. What Lynn carried was flatter than that, quieter, like a room where the last echo had finally stopped. Above the nailed window, the sky went dark, and the 53rd thread fox was already 3 floors down and moving through the grass. Alpha Lord Holt Aaron received the first thread fox 8 months ago in the middle of a territorial mediation with the Cold Fen delegation. It had appeared on the table between a stack of signed accords and a cooling pot of tea, walking with a gait that made his second-in-command, Scylla, push her chair back hard enough to knock it over. Holt caught the fox in one hand before anyone could reach it, and something in him, something low and animal, and not entirely rational, had gone very still. He unfolded the tiny scroll tucked inside the knot of its chest later, alone. The writing was cramped, the ink diluted to near nothing. The note described a water rights issue in the northeastern quadrant of Grayfen territory in detail so precise that when he sent his own surveyors to verify it, they came back unsettled. The erosion had been worse than described. 70 wolves had been losing access to clean water for almost a year, and it had been logged by Derek Vallon as a non-issue. The second fox arrived the following week. This one described a medication shortage. The third, a falsified crop yield report. By the 22nd fox, Holt had built a shelf for them in his private study. He told Scylla it was for organizational purposes. She looked at the shelf, looked at him, and said nothing, which was the closest she came to editorializing. By the 40th fox, he had started sleeping badly. His wolf, which had been a steady and reliable presence for 15 years, paced inside him at night in a way it hadn't since he was young and uncertain. He could not explain it. He could not explain why the notes, which never named their author, never made a personal complaint, never once asked for anything for the writer themselves, had begun to feel less like intelligence reports and more like a debt he was accumulating. The handwriting never changed. The ink was always rationed thin, the paper was always low grade, and the content was always about other people. Sick pups, neglected elders, poisoned water, dying herbs, never once a single sentence about the person writing. This troubled Holt more than the data did. On the night of the 53rd, he woke at 2 in the morning with a smell in his nose he couldn't identify, creek water over smooth stones. The inside of an old book opened after a long time. Something like the charged stillness before a storm breaks. He was packed before dawn. Grayfen Hold was a large house in a territory that should have been prosperous. Holt read it in what was absent. The tree lines too thin, the fields worked hard and fed nothing back. The stream that should have bisected the south pasture rerouted around a new outbuilding that was, he noted, significantly nicer than the pack's communal hall. Derek Vallon came down the front steps with both hands extended and a smile that touched nothing behind his eyes. "Alpha Lord," Derek said. "We weren't given notice of a visit." "No," Holt said pleasantly, "you weren't." He catalogued the assembled pack as Derek led them inside, well-fed at the top, thin at the edges, the distribution of a territory where resources had been moving in one direction for a long time. He noted the cough from the Upper East Wing, 2 voices, young, the wet rattle he'd learned to recognize from years of territorial inspections. And then he stopped walking. The smell reached him between one step and the next. Creek water and old paper and something like charged air before lightning splits a sky. It was coming from above, through timber and plaster and at least one locked door. His wolf went from pacing to arrested, not calm, focused the way a compass needle stops spinning. "Alpha Lord?" Derek's voice, carefully calibrated. "Is something wrong?" "There's someone on the upper floor," Holt said. A pause. "Controlled. Storage rooms, my lord. Nothing of interest." "Whose heartbeat is that?" Holt walked past him. He found the door at the top of the second staircase, half hidden behind a tapestry that had been shifted to cover it. The lock was iron, recently oiled. He'd knocked once, waited 3 seconds. No answer from the outside, because there was no one on the outside. He broke the lock. The smell hit him when the door opened. Damp plaster, old wool, mildew at the window frame, and beneath all of it the particular chemical sweetness of a body that had been underfed long enough to begin metabolizing itself. His wolf made a sound inside him that he did not let reach his face. He went up. The room was small, a compressed cot, a burned-down candle, a table with objects arranged with the precision of someone who has very little, and therefore accounts for all of it, a sewing needle, a wax stub, a smooth piece of wood with thread wound around it, a water-stained almanac with pages fused at the edges, and on the cot, wrapped in a blanket more holes than fabric, a woman. She was slight in the way that deprivation makes a person slight, where the bones become the architecture, and everything else recedes. Her hair was dark auburn and unwashed. Her skin was pale where it wasn't bruised, and it was bruised across both forearms and the left side of her jaw, in overlapping yellow-green that said this had been happening long enough to Leia. Her eyes were hazel, deep warm hazel that caught the flat northern light and held it, the eyes of someone who had spent years cataloguing everything in her immediate environment, and had become very good at it. She looked at him and did not flinch. She went completely still. The particular stillness of someone who has learned that small movements are more dangerous than none. Then the bond hit. He had heard it described 100 ways. He had discounted most of them. What he felt was not romantic. It was structural. As if something in the architecture of his chest that had always been slightly off had found its correct position with a force that was nearly violent. Every other thought became peripheral. There was her. That was the complete and entire fact of the moment. His wolf went silent. Not calm, still, the way a river goes still in a freeze, not absent, just set. He put his hand on the doorframe and stood there for 3 seconds, unable to speak. "You shouldn't be up here," the woman said. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, but entirely steady. "Darek doesn't allow visitors on the upper floor." "What's your name?" he managed. "Lynn." He let the word settle. "Who put those bruises on your jaw, Lynn?" She did not answer, but her eyes moved just slightly toward the floor below them. He went back down. In the entrance hall, Darek was waiting with his smile reconstructed and a story already forming in his posture. Scylla stood between him and the door with her arms loose at her sides. "She came to us as a child," Darek said before Holt could speak. "No family, no wolf. We've taken care of her out of." "I didn't ask you to explain her," Holt said. "I asked who bruised her jaw." "Darek's mate, Hale," said from behind him, smooth and rehearsed. "She's clumsy. The stairs are steep. We've spoken to her about being more careful." "Her jaw," Holt said specifically. Silence. The kitchen clock measured it. "She's an unclaimed Omega," Darek said, and the performance left his voice. What came through underneath was something flat and practical and worse for being both. No wolf, no family, no standing. She's housed and fed. If she occasionally requires correction, that is within my authority as... Holt hit him. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. One step, one movement, his fist into Derek Vallen's ribs with exactly enough force to put the man on his knees without doing anything that couldn't be repaired. Derek folded and went down with a sound like air leaving a bellows. Hale didn't move. Her face was entirely blank, but her hands tightened on the edge of the kitchen table. "Scylla," Holt said without turning around. "Document the upper room, all of it. The bruising especially, everything." He crouched in front of Derek. His voice was level, almost pleasant. The frost forming on the nearest window was not. "That woman upstairs is my mate," he said, "and you have been starving her." He stood. "I'm going to feed her now, and then I'm going to come back and deal with you." He went up the stairs. Lynn was standing when he returned. She had positioned herself in the corner farthest from the door, with the threadbare blanket around her shoulders, and she was watching the staircase with the complete attention of someone who has learned to read what's arriving before it gets there. Holt stopped on the third step from the top. He sat down on it, below her. She looked at him. He could see the calculation in her eyes, not suspicion exactly, more like the habit of someone who has learned to assess every entry before it finishes forming its intentions. "Holt Aren," he said, "Alpha Lord of the Western Reach." "I know who you are." She paused. "The almanac in my room covers the Kethrun Basin water rights going back 40 years. Your name is in the most recent addendum." Another pause. "You negotiated fairly." He stared at her. He had not known what to expect coming up these stairs. He had not expected this. "Lynn," he said, "I've received 53 figures made of thread, each one carrying a note." She went very still. "You've been sending them," he said. "I didn't know where they went." Her voice was careful, precise. The voice of someone who has learned to present information accurately, because accuracy is the only power available to her. "I didn't know if they went anywhere. I wrote things down because otherwise I would forget, and if I forgot, no one would know." A pause. "The twins in the East Room have a chest cough. 11 days. My healer is with them now," he said. "Lynn, the water contamination in the northeastern quarter, the falsified harvest reports, the ventilation problem in the root stores, the ration reductions in the elder households going back 14 months. I have documentation on all of it, because of you." Something moved in her expression, something careful. "I'd like to take you out of this room," he said. "I'd like to feed you. I'd like my healer to look at your jaw. And then, when you're ready, I'd like to explain what I felt when I walked up these stairs, because I think you felt it too, and I think it frightened you, and I think you've been frightened enough." Lynn looked at him for a long time. The candle on her table had burned completely down. Flat grey light came through the unstuck edge of the nailed window. "Hale," she said finally. Her voice shifted into something factual and clean. "The bruises are from Hale, not Derek. She manages the pack accounts. I found where she's been rerouting funds, a secondary account under a false name. I found it because the arithmetic in the public ledger was wrong, and I had nothing else to do for 4 years but notice when numbers were wrong." She touched her jaw. "She told me that if I said anything, she'd stop leaving food at the door. She was correct that no one would have noticed." A pause. "I want you to know I'm not making a complaint. I'm giving you information." The temperature in the room dropped sharply. Lynn flinched. He stopped. He pulled the cold back into himself with an effort that made his hands shake. "That wasn't directed at you," he said. "I apologize." She studied him with that careful, measuring attention. Then she stood and crossed to the table without hurrying, and her hands moved over the thread and the small, smooth piece of wood, and in 40 seconds she set a fox on the tabletop. It shivered, stewed, walked to the edge of the table, and sat there looking at Holt with its seed-bead eyes. "I've never been able to explain it," Lynn said. "I was told I had no wolf, no power, nothing that counted. My parents were gone before I was old enough to ask about them. Derek told me at 11 they abandoned me." She looked at her hands. The ink stains, the paper cuts, the swollen joints at the knuckles. "I think he lied." Holt looked at the thread fox. It turned its small, knotted head and regarded him with an intelligence that wool should not possess, and he felt distinctly and inexplicably, a pulse of recognition, not from the material, from whatever was moving inside it. Something that smelled like creek water and old paper, and the still air before lightning. His wolf, which had not rested in 15 years of ruling, laid itself down inside him, completely. It lay down and was calm. "I need to see your parents' records," he said quietly. "Darek will have them." He found the records in a locked drawer of a desk Hale had declared personal property exempt from review. Scylla had resolved that disagreement with quiet efficiency, and Holt pulled the drawer out of the frame. Inside record, 2 death certificates, a folded note. The birth record listed a girl named Lynn Fenrath. He actually stepped back. "Fenrath," Scylla said from behind him, her voice stripped flat by shock, as in the weaving line, as in the founding bloodline that went extinct 60 years ago. The death certificates listed a man and a woman, both Fenrath, cause of death documented as a border skirmish. The documentation was falsified poorly, dates corrected in 3 places, the authorizing signatures a scrawl that could have belonged to anyone. The note was in Darek's own handwriting. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a reminder he had written to himself. It said, "She must believe she is ordinary. The Fenrath thread site is too dangerous when it wakes. Keep her believing it is a trick. Keep her small." Holt set the note down, left the room, found Darek in the dining hall eating a meal, roasted meat, root vegetables, and imported wine that cost more than the monthly food allocation for 5 of his pack families. Darek looked up and stopped chewing. "She is Fenrath," Holt said. The dining hall went quiet. 40 wolves heard the 2 words and understood what they meant. "You found an orphaned Fenrath heir," Holt said. "Instead of reporting her existence to the Western Reach, you locked her in a room and told her she was broken. You took the only living member of a founding bloodline and convinced her for 20 years that what she could do was a trick. A defect." He looked at Darek's plate, at the imported wine. "While you ate well." Darek ran. It lasted 9 seconds. They came at dawn 3 days later. Lynn heard them from the upper floor, where she had been eating solid food for 4 days and sleeping in a room with an unlocked door. She had not yet stopped checking that it was unlocked before she went to sleep. She suspected she would continue checking for a long time. She was in the hallway when Holt came out of his room in riding gear. "They're here for me," she said. It was not a question. "They heard the Fenrath name," he said. She nodded once. "I'm coming out with you." He wanted to argue. His wolf wanted to put itself between her and the door, and every living thing beyond it. He had made her a promise without saying it, in the way he sat below her on those stairs, in the way he had not reached for her hand when she walked past it. He had promised her the right to choose. "Stay close," he said. She was barefoot. She was always barefoot. The morning dew soaked through to cold ground, and she walked through it like she'd been doing it her entire life. 2 coalition alphas waited at the territory line with 80 wolves behind them. Carrick, grey at the temples, who had controlled the eastern grain trade for 2 decades. Veth, younger and sharper, who had built her pack's power specifically in the vacancy the Fenrath line had left behind. Carrick spoke first. "We've heard the Fenrath name. We've come to ascertain the truth and discuss what it means for the territorial accords." "The truth is standing next to me," Holt said. "Her name is Lynn Fenrath, Soul's surviving heir of the weaving line." Veth laughed. It was not warm. She looked at Lynn directly. "A threadmaker. We heard she knotted wool animals that walk. Is that the proof of bloodline we're being asked to honor?" She looked at Holt. "An omega who can't shift." Lynn raised one hand. The air around it went silver, not as a metaphor, a visible, soft, pulsing light that moved with her heartbeat, with the particular rhythm of something that had been contained for a very long time finally finding room. At the edge of the territory, where the tree line met the open field, shapes materialized between the trunks, fox shapes, dozens of them, stepping out of the shadows in total silence. They were not wool, not knotted thread. They were solid silver-white light, dense and present, and their eyes were the same deep, warm hazel as Lynn's, and they were everywhere, flanking the 80 assembled wolves on 3 sides before anyone had registered them beginning to appear. Nobody moved. The silence lasted long enough that the morning birds in the tree line went quiet too. Carrick exhaled slowly. He was the oldest one in the field and the only one old enough to remember what the Fenrath light looked like in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. He stared at the silver foxes, at Lynn. His expression traveled through several stages before settling somewhere that wasn't fear and wasn't submission, and was considerably more complicated than either. "The Fenrath I knew," he said quietly, "used starlings. She sent them to council when she didn't feel like attending in person, each one carrying a specific message to a specific seat." He stopped. His jaw worked. She was the most precise mind I encountered in 40 years of territorial politics. She was not easy. She was always fair. A pause. "I hope you inherited that last part." "I'd like to hear about her," Lynn said, "if you'd be willing." Carrick nodded, slowly, like a man making a decision he'd been building toward for several minutes. Veth hadn't shifted her weight, but she was watching Lynn with an expression that had moved past contempt into something she was working to control. "How long?" she said. "In that room?" 4 years locked, Lynn said. Before that, various floors of the house. Veth's jaw tightened. Something crossed her faces. Personal, brief, immediately suppressed. "I'll attend a council," she said, and the stiffness in her voice was the stiffness of someone making a concession that costs them something. "That's all I'm agreeing to." The silver foxes held their positions until both coalitions stood down. Then they faded slowly, the way light leaves a room at evening. Not all at once, just gradually absent until the tree line looked ordinary again. Lynn's knees buckled. Holt caught her. She was still too light. He was going to spend a long time being angry about how light she still was, and he was going to do it quietly and away from her. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder. He could feel her heart beat against his chest, rapid and steadying. "I didn't know I could do that," she said. "I know." "I've never." She stopped, breathed. "I thought I was broken for 20 years. "You weren't broken," he said. "You were the only person in that room who wasn't." The council took 2 weeks. Lynn approached it the way she approached everything, methodically, from a foundation of documented observation. She had 4 years of careful noticing. She had almanac data memorized. She had the falsified ledgers Scylla had photographed, the financial records Hale had hidden, the misdirected pack resources she had tracked through the sounds of old timber. She did not demand restored territory. She proposed a cooperative water rights framework and a restoration fund built from Hale's embezzled accounts, which turned out to be substantially larger than anyone except Hale had known. She presented the proposal in that quiet, precise voice she had developed over 4 years of telling thread foxes about things that mattered and no one else was recording. Carrick voted in her favor first. During the mid-session break, he told her about her grandmother over 2 cups of tea in the corner of the great hall, how the elder Fenrath had once sent silver starlings to deliver individual voting notices to every council member who had been too occupied to review a proposed border accord, each starling landing on a specific shoulder and declining to relocate until its scroll had been acknowledged and signed. "She would have found you frustrating," Carrick said. "You're more patient than she ever was." She'd have said patience was a luxury she never got. He turned his cup in his hands. She would have been proud of the proposal. She was always better at restoration than at punishment. Veth voted in favor on the second day after a private conversation with Lynn that lasted 90 minutes and that neither woman ever discussed with anyone else. The tribunal for Darek and Hale Vallon was held on the final morning. Darek wept when the charges were read, suppression of bloodline identity, unlawful confinement, assault, embezzlement, falsification of public records. He stood before the council with his arm in a sling and said he had been afraid, that the Fenrith power was too dangerous, that he had been protecting his pack, his people, his territory. For one fractional moment, Holt almost disbelieved him. Not the justification, the fear. Darek had been genuinely terrified of what she might become, and that terror had calcified into cruelty that he had reframed as necessity every single morning for years, which was worse than the fear, because it meant he had never once stopped choosing it. Hale said nothing when her charges were read. She stood with her chin level and looked at Lynn and said, "I knew what you were the first time I saw one of those things move across my desk. I knew you would unravel everything we'd built." A pause. Her voice did not waver. "I wasn't wrong about what you would do. I was wrong about whether it needed doing." Then she held out her wrists and did not resist. Darek was stripped of his alpha status and exiled. Hale was sentenced to supervised service, her considerable accounting skills redirected toward restitution that would run for several years. The Grayfen pack stayed largely intact under interim leadership. The twins in the East Wing were already improving on the protocol Lynn had described from memory. She was at the hallway window that evening when he came to find her. Not the nailed window, that one had been opened on the second day, the iron pegs removed, the frame unstuck with some effort. The window she stood at now faced west, where the last light was going amber in the tops of the tree line. She had thread in her hands, working it without looking, the way she always did when she was thinking. "I want to tell you something," she said without turning. He leaned against the doorframe. "All right. I'm not doing this because of the bond." She turned then. The amber light was in her hair. "I'm not doing this because you outrank him, or because you broke that drawer out of the desk, or because of the Fenrath name, or because the law makes you the logical." "Why then?" His voice was quiet. She looked at him for a long time. Her thumb kept moving over the thread in her hands. "Because you sat below me on the stairs," she said. "Because the first time I walked past your hand, you didn't reach for it again. Because you received 53 letters about sick children and bad water and dying herbs." She crossed the hall, stopped in front of him, raised her ink-stained hands and put them against his face, her thumbs at the angle of his jaw. "Because you caught every fox I sent into the dark, and you let me find you at my own pace." He turned his face into her palm. He had not been the kind of man who showed much of anything for a long time, and the fact that she could feel what she felt in the press of his cheek against her hand meant something she wasn't going to put into words yet. When she marked him, her teeth were entirely human. The mark she left was small, but when she bit down, every thread fox she had ever knotted materialized simultaneously, on the windowsills, in the hallway, in the tree line beyond the fence, an army of silver-white light summoned by something that had been caged for 20 years and was no longer. He marked her back with his wolf too close to the surface to be fully restrained, and the sound she made was not pain. The thread foxes on the sill glowed silver. The morning she left Grayfen Hold, she walked through the house once more. She checked on the East Wing twins. The cough was clearing. The younger one braided a strip of torn cloth into her hair while she crouched there, and she let him finish before she stood. She folded him a small thread fox, a glowing one, silver-edged, the kind that would keep its light for a long time. She went to the upper room. The lock had been removed from the outside of the door. The cot was gone. The compressed mattress was gone. The room was being cleared, properly aired, the window unpegged and latched open to let the southern light in for the first time. She stood in the doorway. The table was still there. On it, her things, the sewing needle, the wax stub, the almanac with its water-fused pages, the smooth piece of wood she'd wound her thread around. Someone had set them aside carefully instead of discarding them. She left one thread fox on the table. She didn't tuck a note inside it. There was no one left to send it to. It shivered, found its feet, walked to the table's edge, and sat there with its seed-bead eyes catching the new light from the south-facing window. A small, knotted guardian in a room that was, finally, just a room. She turned and walked down the stairs and out through the kitchen door into the morning. Holt was there, leaning against the outside wall in the early sun, arms crossed, watching her with that particular quiet expression he wore when he was paying attention and not bothering to conceal it. Behind him, through the gap in the fence line, the rerouted stream had been redirected back to its original course. The water ran clear over smooth stones, and along the south bank, the first green shoots of the herbs she'd been monitoring through 2 floors of planking for 4 years were pushing up through the restored mud, small and certain. She stopped on the bottom step. He held out his hand. This time she took it on the first reach.